All right, so what I'd like to do first is to, and we're supposed to have a double session. We'll see how much we do with respect to this first part, which is really the introduction. You have on my learning all the material that I will use, the PowerPoint presentations, as well as the course outline. And in the course outline, you will see the curriculum, the expectations, what coursework assignments that will be given to you and so on. So you'll have all of that. What typically happens with the coursework is that you have options. We have approval to do the coursework in different ways. You could do 2 essays or 2 assessments, or we can instead actually do a debate. And for many years, we used to do debates. We would choose 3 or 4 themes, and we'll have different teams of 2 who will do 4 against a topic, and then we'll do a debate in class. So if you want to practice speaking and you want to do practice debating, you could do that as an assignment as well. So just something to think about. And again, the judges will be myself and Valerie. Okay, so think about it as we go along. There is a mark. In fact, you get 0.5% for each time you attend the class. So there's 5% over the semester just for attendance. That's because we expect you to attend and to participate. And because you're supposed to speak to, and today, I know you may not be prepared for that, but next time around, to speak to some of the issues in the paper that would have been assigned for you to read. So we expect this to be very interactive, and for you to come back and tell me, well, what you think, and so the guidelines on the paper summary is really to help you to read and summarize, and then come back and speak to that. So I'm not going to ask you to submit the summary. That's for you to guide whatever discussion. So it's not going to be a hard assignment you have to do. It's really to support what you're doing. Any comment from you, Valerie, at this stage?
No.
Okay, good. So let's get started then. And the first thing would be the course objectives. And with this course, typically I don't stand when I do this course because often it's more an interactive session, and it's those kinds of discussions. So that what I'm sharing here, I don't like to stand for this, right? So typically with most other courses, I will stand and lecture. This is not a lecture. Okay, so don't treat it like that. And therefore, you could interrupt anytime. It's not an interruption. You could just, if you have something to say, you have a question, you have a comment, please just add it. All right, and I will repeat it if it's a question so that Valerie can hear it if she doesn't hear it directly from you. So you may need to speak up today. Next week, I'll bring a camera that will have a built-in speaker that will show the class, and then she would be able to hear you much, much better. All right. So overall, what we are trying to do here is to provide knowledge of the relationship between GIS usage and society. I am assuming that you know what GIS is, right? And you understand a lot of the technical issues. And so you understand how we design and implement it. But the thing is, often you have to think in terms of, well, what is that relationship between the GIS that you build and society? How does it impact? What are the benefits? What are the limitations? Those are things that are important. It's like any other technology or any other tool that we have. I'm sure you've been following all the debates about AI and the pros and cons of AI. And so right away, you're thinking about those things. And it's like other things as well. When the inventors of dynamite came up with that invention, he was excited because he thought it'd be very important to help the persons who are doing construction work, mining work, civil engineering type of work, who is excited. Because here is a new technology that is really beneficial to a lot of people. However, we all know that there are a lot of negative impacts of dynamite. Yeah. So yes, please go ahead, Gabriella.
Add on to that, a lot of like things do not when they, when they invent the bomb.
Mm-hmm.
It's for the sake of science, and it's to say that they have done it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they in theory they can do it, and then they want to say, okay, I've done it in real life. And the question is like whether we should do it rather than whether we can do it.
Mm-hmm.
Like the AI as well, and the, I guess, moral repercussions.
Yeah.
And
So a lot of times that but you see, the thing is, often the scientists don't think through all of those moral and ethical issues, and it oftentimes it's the other people who who spend time looking at those issues, and they're thinking, well, yes, this is nice, but what about the impacts of this? And so in a way, that's what we want to do with this course. To say, yes, GIS is important, it's useful, but what are some of the issues and challenges that you've encountered or you will likely to encounter when dealing with this? So Valerie, maybe I can ask you to jump in here a little bit and talk a little bit about your own experiences, because you've been working in GIS, you have done a fair amount of GIS design and development for various clients. And so again, what do you think are some of the things that you have seen in terms of the benefits and limitations and some of the issues and challenges that you have encountered with respect to GIS in your own experience?
Okay, so we can recount a lot of the experiences that we've seen in the Caribbean in terms of benefits. Certainly, persons are amazed at how it makes they don't no longer have to think about gut feeling, but they're now seeing the data and they now have raw information. It also helps them in automating certain processes. So, sorry. So, for example, one project that we worked on, you would have had to go in the field to collect lots of data, have field persons there. But then the decision makers are now able to sit at their desks and they're now able to analyze that information and make decisions once the database is kept up to date. So what right there from their desk. So efficiency gains, all of those things are benefits. Some of the limitations or the challenges that we face, especially in the Caribbean, shortage of skilled professionals is one. So clearly one of the things that what you're doing now is going to add to the pool of professionals that are there. And also just sometimes a lot of data exists, sometimes it doesn't have metadata associated with it. The sharing policies. So governments and different organizations, they tend to have this mentality of wanting to hold on to that data. Rightly so or wrongly so, that exists. And so there's no policy surrounding how they share with others. And even within the same country and within different governments and line ministries, there is that issue of sharing and how you access the information. So these are some of the things that I have certainly seen across the region that needs to be addressed. And then there's the whole matter of building the awareness at the decision maker level, because sometimes they do not understand the value of it. And as GIS professionals, sometimes we tend to talk to ourselves because we do not know how to articulate it so that people can understand the true benefits in terms of a return on investment from a financial perspective.
So thanks for that. And so you see, a lot of what we are going to try to achieve here in terms of the objectives are things that from a professional who is out there in the industry would speak to in terms of what she would have witnessed. So we see benefits and limitations, we see ethical and legal issues, because we are, as practitioners, we will have a legal duty. We have to do what is called due diligence. We have to make sure that we meet our legal responsibilities to provide accurate data, that we provide data that can be used for the intended purpose for which you were contracted. We have to think in terms of privacy issues and ensuring that we don't infringe people's privacy by the data we collect and we share. So there are issues with respect to that. So we are going to examine those ethical and legal issues. Valerie mentioned standards and policies, data sharing policies, standards, metadata standards. You've heard the term metadata. You know what metadata is, right? So when we in fact, Esri talks about data curation. And you know, in the museum, you have a curator. What is the role of the curator? Anyone, what do you think they, you know, and why do museums have curators? What do you think?
Yeah.
When you say manage the collection, what do you mean? All right. What about a librarian? What is the role of a librarian? How do you know, you know, if you have to go and do a search to get a book, how do you know how to what books are available and what the book is dealing with?
So they catalog information about each object for museum objects.
So each artifact, yeah.
Yeah. And for a librarian, the other information, dates, publication information, and all of that will be in system query. So
data cataloging is like curation, data curation, and data curation is like metadata. Yeah. So there are a lot of similarities, there are a lot of parallels with respect to making sure that we have standards to document, and the librarians, for example, they have cataloging standards. There are metadata standards that are used across the globe, you know, ISO standards that we use for documenting or for data curation. And so those things are important. And so we'll talk about the need for those kinds of things and why these things are important to make sure that we can protect ourselves and protect our clients and protect you know, society as well, because you know, standards are important and documenting is important. It's like when you go to buy any kind of food item, you know, if you suffer with high cholesterol, for example, you want to make sure that the label on the package, you know, there's truth in it, because it tells you whether you could use this. If you're lactose intolerant, you don't want to buy any product that will impact you. Or if you have problems with diabetes, you have to look at the sugar content, because again, you don't want to find yourself in trouble. And so that's the same kind of thing. It's a truth in labeling with respect to geospatial data. And so that's why we have to think about standards and we have to document. So we'll talk about the relevance and importance of those kinds of things. And we also have to think in terms of data sharing policies. Valerie mentioned that some data developers, they don't like to share that data. They don't want to give it away, they don't want to sell it, they just want to hoard it. And the thing is, with certain kinds of things, the value is in its use. And therefore, and in fact, I've heard a lot of GIS practitioners say, the more it is used, the more useful it becomes, because the more people it will impact. And those kinds of things are important. So understanding data sharing policies, why do we need them? How do we develop those? And you know, how do people benefit from having these things are also part and parcel of the discussion. So these are the overall objectives. Out of the objectives, and this is typical education speak, we always, when we do a course, we always have learning outcomes. What you ought to know at the end of the course. And there's a reason why we put this in here as well. At least speaking for myself, whenever I set an exam, and just so you know, and I will come to that later, the coursework component is worth 30%, and the exam component is worth 70%. And typically you get a 2-hour exam, 4 questions before. That's what we do. That's the policy we follow. I think you've seen that before, right? If you didn't know that, now you know. But the learning outcomes is what I'll be testing. So if you ask me what coming in exam, that. I'm going to test you've met the learning outcomes. That's typically what we do. So upon successful completion of the course, you should be able to explain the relationship between GIS usage and society. All of this is, as I said, it's in your PowerPoint note. So just make a note. This is your hint. This is your exam, right? That's what we're going to ask about. Evaluate the benefits and limitations of GIS usage in the society. Evaluate the need for standards and policies for sharing geospatial data, and explain the ethical and legal implications associated with the provision of geospatial data. One of the things I will talk about later on in one of the sessions would be what are the expectations of a GIS professional. Because I see this as a profession, and therefore as professionals, there are certain professional behavior that one is expected to adhere to. And so we'll talk about that. And so I'll do a whole session, and that one would actually be a lecture. We'll talk about being a professional, a GIS professional. Yeah. All right, so those are the learning outcomes. And so how the course is designed, and you will see this in the outline, the weeks, there's a table with the actual weeks, and all of these things will be covered in there. So we'll talk about the structure of modern society. So today we'll talk about society and the structure of society. We will talk about the social implications of GIS, social barriers affecting the wider use of GIS. And there are a lot of things. One of the things that a lot of us in societies like ours assume is that we are used to having smartphones. We are used to having access to a lot of technology. But there are a lot of societies where people don't have access to radios. They don't have access to electricity. They don't have access, much less smartphones and TVs and other things, internet and so on. So when we talk about things, we assume certain kinds of things about, well, GIS now, because there's so much open source software, open access software packages, and you can download a lot of data. Well, you assume that it's a level playing field, but it's never a level playing field because of the particular challenges that you have in different societies. Even in the Caribbean, and again, Valerie can jump in here if you like, Val, to talk about your own experience with respect to the disparities that you see in Caribbean societies with respect to access to different things. I don't know if you've thought about that in terms of what kinds of experiences you've had. I mean, you're doing work at the OECS level, and even within the OECS, you would have seen the differences in terms of what resources are available across these different islands in that particular region. So any thoughts on what some of those things are? What you think?
Yes, certainly. I mean, we can just bend our minds back to a couple of years ago where the COVID-19 pandemic, it's not something that we're going to soon forget. And if we just think, even not thinking about GIS specifically, just think about the burden that it caused for parents, because they thought, even persons who thought that they had adequate technology, they may have had one computer at home, which the child would have used to do their work. But all of a sudden, they were now using that computer to do their work. So now the child also needed it for schoolwork. And so one of the things that we saw in a different environment is that there were just children who did not have access to even a phone to be able to do those online work. And so we recognize that there were technology deserts that were out there, not just in terms of lack of devices, but also in terms of access to internet in several places across the Caribbean. If we multiply that and we look at some of what is needed for different ministries and departments and even companies to use geospatial technologies in this day and age, especially if we're using imagery and things like that, that is data intensive, then we recognize that there is an issue across the Caribbean, from bandwidth issues to several other kinds of issues, just the regular infrastructure. But, and I know we haven't gone into the courses yet, so don't know how much you know of what is called national spatial data infrastructures, which is where you're pretty much building out an infrastructure to support your GIS at an enterprise level nationally. We have come to recognize that across the Caribbean, there is a big disparity in how the different islands and countries, the levels that they're at. Some persons are just now thinking about it, while others are advanced. Some people have not put in place their policies. Some people have nothing at all. And these are some of the issues in terms of GIS playing, or geospatial information playing, a more pivotal role in the region, achieving, as everybody is trying to achieve, those sustainable development goals.
So Valerie, I'll interject here and ask the class, in terms of, have you heard the term NSDI? Are you familiar with it? Have you not been briefed on any of that? All right, well, one of the things we will talk about is National Spatial Data Infrastructures, NSDI as we call them. And that will be one of our discussions later on. So I realize that there is a gap there, and we'll have to talk about it. And that will be something that I could speak to. I know Val will have some ideas as well, but this is an area where, in fact, in Trinidad and Tobago, we had set up a National Spatial Data Infrastructure Council, and I was chairman of the board of directors. So I am familiar with it, and I will speak to that at some other point. This is the intro class, so, you know, not the right time, but we certainly come back to that. And so we see that there are a lot of issues. We'll talk about how we represent information, knowledge, and in fact, knowledge representation in GIS can actually marginalize certain groups. There are certain kinds of ways, there are ways that some people would design systems, you know. So we always talk about GIS was invented in a particular jurisdictions where you have a particular context and culture. And because of that, when they design the way data is represented in a digital environment, it is from that particular cultural context. And so if you have groups who treat with information in a different way, that information is not necessarily represented as effectively as would information from these particular contexts where the GIS is developed. It can't be represented the same way, and therefore you would have marginalized particular groups from particular societies. We talk about traditional knowledge. We talk about indigenous knowledge. We talk about you know, particular societies where you don't, it's not a, you know, individuals are not the foremost or the most prominent in that society, but more it's a group rather than individuals. And so So those kinds of things and how we represent those things, you know, would be different. So Val, go ahead.
Yeah, so as Dr. Ramla speaks to the whole matter of knowledge representation, I would be remiss if I didn't speak to the fact that one of the things that we have on the forefront these days is the whole matter of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the geospatial industry. And we're not just talking about it because it's something that is nice to talk about. It's because we recognize that it impacts the innovation, it impacts how information gets fed to us as persons, and so we need that diversity. And so in one of those lectures, I'd love to share with you, there is a work that is done by the World Geospatial Industry Council. I now chair the group I chair the committee on diversity, equity, and inclusion at that level. And how do we get to make sure that persons like you and myself have a seat at the table, and it's not just the usual suspects? And I can say who the usual suspects are. It's going to be old white men in gray suits, and that has traditionally been the case. And how do we change that and move the needle?
Yeah, thanks for that, Valerie. That's something else we will get into as well. And we will also talk about internet mapping and how we've moved a lot more from the desktop mapping or the local area network and so on. And more we have gone into web mapping, and a lot more of those kinds of distributed type systems that we have. And the fact that more than ever, we have web GIS, and there are a lot of geoportals that are available across the globe. And Valerie and I were involved in developing something called the Caribbean Geoportal. And so we'll show you some of that and show you how that would have impacted our ability to work in the Caribbean region. So again, you know, that would be important because we can leverage these kinds of resources to support groups that are disadvantaged, groups that may not have access to the kind of resources or the deep pockets that large organizations would have and government agencies would have. And so for groups, especially groups who may have to advocate for certain kinds of things to support their particular agenda, could benefit from having, you know, access to geoportals and so on. And you know, we'll show you a few other examples, stuff that Dr. Edwards and I would have developed, and things that Dr. Edwards would have developed as well. And so we would look at some of these web you know, solutions that are out there. We will spend time, and I will you know, for each of these topics, ethical issues in GIS, privacy issues, legal issues, policy issues are all going to be discussed as separate items within the course. A lot of the work I personally have done deal with legal issues and policy issues in GIS. And those are areas that I'm quite interested in. And so we will talk a bit about that. And of course, the use and misuse of GIS as the final topic. So this overall is what we're going to do in the course. The details of the course, as I said, the assessed coursework is 30%. The final exam is 70%. Now, you will see that I have scheduled 4:26, and there's a reason for that. This is supposed to be a 3-hour section, but I expect you to spend time reading. And therefore, the amount of time you have to spend must be at least equivalent to an hour and a half every week. But I suspect you'll be doing more, because that's the idea. So that what we do really is when you come, we do a PowerPoint, we do a discussion. And because you would have invested the time to read. So that's why it's not a full 3 hours, but not even 2 hours. I prefer to keep it short and tight and make sure that you're on top of things, and we can get a lot more done like this. All right, so that's why it's a little shorter with respect to what the expectations are. One of the things I will also tell you is that when you start reading and throughout this course, it's just so much work. It is a lot of work, but every single cohort who have done this course have said to me after the fact that it was a lot of fun and it was very useful. So I expect you to complain. Don't worry, it's all right, you can complain. But I expect also at the end of the day, you'll see the value. And that's why it is important. All right, so we'll go through. Now, one of the things that this course speaks to is GIS and Society. Yeah. Yes, yes. All right, so I'm assuming you this one there, the staff one? Yeah, I think you can do that one. It's open for students after hours. Yeah, so it should be open. Yeah, you know where it is, right? On your yeah, on your right. Yeah. So if I were to ask you what is GIS, what would you say? By now you should know, right? You've done a semester in the NSC Informatics program and you've done a principles of GIS. So all right, yes, yes. So geographic information systems, technologies, to help with respect to analyzing, making decisions, supporting decision making with respect to geospatial challenges. Okay, so yeah, agree? Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah. Hardware and software. So that's what we use to analyze spatially referenced data to produce information. And we analyze the data, we understand the relations between different data sets.
So yeah, so yes, we in a way that's a technical definition with respect to the hardware and software. But you have to think in terms of the procedures and the techniques, the the standards and specifications and all the things associated with being able to use all the tools and technologies to support the processing and the analysis and the decision. So yeah, so just to expand a little more in terms of seeing it as more than hardware, software, data, people and application. So there are a lot of other things that a lot of times you'd find that when you examine any particular issue, I remember having to explain to somebody, we were doing a stakeholder analysis. And who are your stakeholders? And so, you ask people at the UE, well, who are your stakeholders? And they think, well, it's the lecturers, the support staff, the students. And so only earlier today, I had a meeting and I said to my colleagues, see, this trail, the holding all this water, that is part of our responsibility because the UE belongs to taxpayers. And the taxpayers of Trinidad and Tobago, the taxpayers. And therefore, they're by far one of our most important stakeholders because they're paying the bills. Yes, yes. And so when we think about, we have to think the picture in terms of all these various things. So we know what GIS is. So let's talk about society. So I have a definition here, but what do you see in your own perception? How would you define society? See? And I'll ask Valerie to come in and give a particular perspective on what you see as a society as well.
I think society. So, social networks, That's, I think. What I mean, that would happen.
Yeah, all right. So, but the thing is, you always hear people talk about Caribbean society or American society, yeah, or society wouldn't stand for this. Hmm? And what these fellas would stand for, these other people wouldn't stand for. Yeah. So what do you think, what defines it? What makes it what it is?
They define themselves.
Mhm. Yeah. So Valerie, I don't know if you got any of that from the students, but and they spoke basically around several things I have here in the definition. And so anything you want to add to what we have as a definition or anything? If you could-
I didn't hear what they said, but the definition pretty much sums it up, because when I think of society, I think of the social structure, the organized pattern of relationship, social institutions, those kind of things. Elements like your family, your government, your educational systems, all of those things. Culture, I think, is a big part of society, because that's why, as you mentioned, we talk about Caribbean society or American society. It's about our customs, our norms, our history, what caused us to bind together, and also the interpersonal relationships that exist in the members of society. I also think society has some shared goals and values. That's why we talk about our society wouldn't stand to that, for that, those kind of things, and our institutions, and how all of these things intertwine.
Yeah, you kind of preempted what I'm going to say next, but thank you. That's actually dead on with respect to how I see it as well. And so the particular cultural expectations and in fact even within particular countries you have almost micro societies. You have people who would have different cultural expectations and so if you think about Trinidad and Tobago, Tobago society is somewhat different. I wouldn't say marked, there isn't a marked difference, but there are several differences that could be obvious. So and often you hear people talk about small island societies as opposed to metropolitan societies, large societies. And even within, you go to, I always remember this, having lived in the US for a while, how different it was in terms of what the norms and what the expectations were. If you lived in New England, you lived in Maine, as opposed to you live in New York, or you live in one of the Western states, how very different these different societies or smaller sections of societies would be as opposed to what is considered American society and American culture. It was very obvious to me, and where I felt comfortable and where I didn't, as a result of the way these different sectors of societies were built up and what was expected. So for example, I remember going to Indiana to Purdue University for a job interview, and after spending about 3 or 4 days, I realized I wasn't going to. It wasn't a place that I would be comfortable with. And I studied at the University of Maine, which is in New England, and I was very comfortable there. It felt very different. My wife is from Maine too. It made a difference, I suppose. But I was, when I went, I didn't know that. So that's the thing. Sometimes even within what seems to be a single society is not exactly that. And even within our particular context here in Trinidad and Tobago, you would find that different parts of the island, you have different cultural expectations, you have different norms, you have different types of of expected behavior and values. It's very different. So you have to recognize that and understand that when you're dealing with solutions, you're dealing with trying to arrive at something that will work in the particular context. You have to recognize that. I remember working on a participatory GIS project in Tobago, and the first thing I did was I hired someone from Tobago to serve as the liaison with the public, because as a Trinidadian, they would ignore me. They wouldn't take me on. And you might find that amazing working with one country, but it isn't. And so for the credibility and the success of the project, I had to get a Tobagonian who was well liked and well known. And that made all the difference. We were able to engage and we were able to bring success to the project. But those kinds of things, as a practitioner, you have to recognize, you have to appreciate and make sure that you're aware of that. Yeah. Valerie, you want to jump in with anything with respect to any experiences you've had in terms of working in different contexts? Because
Yes, definitely. So it's amazing, you know. I recall working with a French company in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, and they told me the hard time that they had getting data. And so I was really dreading going there to start the project. And when I got there within 2 days, I pretty much got everything. And the only difference was that I'm a Caribbean person. I so they were more receptive to me. We understood each other. And so that in itself was a subculture, as they thought the rest who were there, they saw them as they're not a part of us. You're Europeans coming to ask for this thing. So even within the Caribbean context, we find those things happening as well. And so I could definitely relate to your example in Trinidad and Tobago, even though it is one country, to see how that happens. So it happens at that level, it happens at the regional level. And we've had experiences where you have to recognize that. You have to make sure that your team have local persons on the ground when you go into these different countries as well.
yes, and so that is why it's important to recognize that and to know that what you're doing is, technology. When you introduce it, you're not introducing it into a sterile environment. You're introducing it into a context that has a culture, that has values, that has expectations, and therefore you need to spend the time. You're investing the time with respect to that. So I want to go next and talk about. We have been speaking to all these things, and I just want to quickly make sure that you're very clear on what the elements of a social structure is. And so I have here 6 important elements. And we've spoken to these, but just to make sure that we're very clear. So as we go along and we have further discussions and I talk about society and the structures of society and the elements of the structure of society, I want to make sure that we're clear on this. And so I'll go through this relatively quickly because I have a few other things I wanted to cover. And so I suspect today we'll catch up. We have enough time. Except I do know that we have Carnival Tuesday. What I would also say is that if for any reason, and I will interject this here, if for any reason you aren't able to physically come, I will share a Zoom link. And there are 1 or 2 sessions that Valerie may want to lead. And so what I could do, if you like, because I'm allowed to do it, to have the session completely virtually. I could do virtual sessions as well. And so you don't even have to come to campus. You can do it. I'll set it up and I'll run it from home. And Valerie will join from the US. She has to join virtually anyway. And so we'll do that too. So we'll do a few sessions virtually. So that if, for example, we can't do a Tuesday for whatever reason, and you want to do perhaps another day, I know your schedules are packed, but if you want to do a 1 hour after class or 1 hour at some other point, or And the other thing I can do, if you like, is I can record the session and have it for you for your asynchronous review and so on. So I am happy to use technology. I love to use technology for all kinds of things. And so if required, we'll do that, right? Just to make sure that we stay on top of this. Right. And I know Valerie would be very happy to facilitate some of that too. All right, so the various elements, we talk about values, groups and institutions, organizations, collectivities, and we'll see what that, roles and norms. And some of these you recognize. Let's go straight to each of these, I guess. I can cover these very quickly. Let me see if I can turn off my camera and therefore hide the a part of it. Normally, you hear people talk about the values of a society. These are, and you will also hear people say that the values of society, values are changing. And what is acceptable now, 20, 30, 40 years ago, were not acceptable. There are things, people would have frowned on. I remember growing up, it was not normal to see women in a bar, or you would not normally see women smoking. That was in our context, you just wouldn't see it. It just was not something that was accepted, you see? So people were committed to certain things. And they held me and dear to their hearts. Women couldn't dress in a particular way. They that's just how it was. And there are other things like that. Where, these days it's quite acceptable. In terms of rights, human rights, and sexual orientation, and lots of other things like that. It's very different. And some people would say, rightly so, and other people would say, God help us, that kind of thing. That it's awful, and it's the worst it's ever been. You see, so there are people who see it as gloom and doom, and other people who see it as a very positive evolution of society based on these changing values that we have. But the values are things that people feel, committed to at that point in time, in the evolution of society. Yeah. Any comments or any questions on this? You follow? This seems pretty obvious, right? If you have any comments, you can, or your thoughts, please. Anything? We good? Right. So, what is interesting as well, though, is that if you come, one of the things I have had to experience, when you come into a society, you have to understand what the values of that society is. And if you're a foreigner coming into a society like Trinidad and Tobago, there are a lot of things that will surprise you. In fact, I suffered what I call re-entry culture shock when I came back from the Netherlands, where I studied first. And then took me about 6-7 months to get back used to the system and get used to people and how they saw things. And when I went away to study in the US and came back, I had a similar, experience. And similarly for my wife, who came from the United States, it took her a while to get used to a lot of things. And there are things that she still hasn't gotten used to. It just frustrates her, because, she comes from a different system and refused to accept some of the inefficiencies and some of the way people see things, because she's not wired like that, I suppose. But that's the thing. So, but it takes a while to understand that, and that's why it's important when you get into a particular society, a particular context, you understand what those values are. What are the things that are important? What do people count as important to them? And what they'd like people to abide with respect to what they see as important. In societies, you'll have groups and institutions. We talk about the family as an institution. We talk about academic institutions, political institutions, religious institutions. So the family is centered around getting food and other items. Items of wealth, procreation, you know, we have the religious institution, worship, the political institutions, ruling, yeah, governance. We talk about communities as well, and there are different kind of communities. A lot of times a community, when we talk about communities, you know, human beings, that's the locality with all the various what we call social capital and other things that are within that grouping that will allow you to live in a particular context. So communities is by far one of the most important social structure if you think about. You hear a lot of people talk about, you know, living in a particular community and they're happy with that community. Of course, there are also judgments and people draw conclusions about particular communities. If I were to say, for example, Lavantil, right away, there's a perception. If I say Goodwood Park, again, a different community altogether. Yeah. Oh, where are you from?
I'm from Trinidad.
Uh-huh.
I was born here, but I grew up in Korea.
Okay.
My dad.
Okay. So you could well imagine I mean, I don't know how long when you came back, but I can well imagine the particular you know, learning and understanding the values and the re-entry culture shock and all the other things that you had to go through, and what you perceive, the perceptions you would have with respect to different parts of the country and so on. Yours may be very different than the other ones who have other classmates who would have lived most of their lives here and experience and understand things that perhaps you are learning and getting to understand.
For sure.
Yes, and so you would see things differently. So that's why I'm trying to make sure that I explain so that at least I know you get a sense of these things as well, because I've experienced that myself and I've seen my wife had to, you know, have to go through a lot of those kind of things as well. So it's important to understand. Of course, within societies, we have things like, you know, social class. We have different ethnic groups. I remember growing up in a particular context, and when I came here a few years ago, somebody said to me, but you know, you get away with certain kinds of things because you are LSI. And I said, but what do you mean? You ever had term? Well, a light-skinned Indian, a person of Indian origin, and I'm you know, very light-skinned. Well, Valerie, you know that, right? You can see that, right? So, and because of that, amongst the Indian community, I am treated differently. And it never occurred to me. I never understood any of that. No one ever mentioned that to me. But when somebody finally mentioned that to me here at, you know, lunchroom one day, and I'm like, oh yeah. It then hit me that perhaps because I come from a different, you see, amongst the Indian community, most of course, well, the Indians came from India. therefore parents came from India. There's a whole caste system. And the caste, a lot of it had to do with also the skin, color and different gradations. So the darker you are, chances are, you came from a particular caste. And the Brahmins, the highest caste, were light skin, very light skin. And so that was used and brought here. You don't take away something in 200 years that existed for 5 or 10,000 years. It's, cultural change is a very slow thing. But then you also have different ethnic groups, different racial, preferences in particular societies. And again, based on my own experience, my wife is Caucasian, and I would walk into certain stores and there's an assumption that we had a particular amount of income. We were affluent and we were treated differently. In Trinidad, yeah, that happens. And so that's the thing. And so that is part and parcel of the thing that you understand about a society, in general. And I don't know, Val, if you have any of your own personal experience. You don't have to share them, but certainly I suspect you may have had your experience as well, coming from. Yes.
Certainly. I mean, I was one of the first females to have a company, a geospatial company in the Caribbean, in a male-dominated space. That in itself, as you talk about things, how society views it, was a barrier. And you had to work harder to get into that boys' club. So there are those things, and then you take it to another level and you go outside of the Caribbean and you start recognizing you have two different areas of intersectionalities dealing with. You not only have gender to deal with, but you also have race to deal with. So these are some of the issues that you see in society, and it's there, and you have to know how to navigate it.
Yes, for sure. And so those are the kinds of things that you find sometimes. And so as a practitioner, you are going to deal with particular grouping, and you need to be aware that these are things that could happen and you could be exposed to just because of what you look like. I remember going somewhere in my early 20s, and no, it was my 30s. I had my PhD then, and going, and somebody, I go in and I said, I am Dr. Bisham Ramlal, and they look at me and they said, no, we thought we'd see some old Indian guy. And I said, but how you could judge like that? But that is how it was. People didn't have a problem, speaking their minds with respect to ethnicity and what they assume. Of course, I have had that experience. I went to a Chinese restaurant and I ordered food in English, and an old Chinese woman came up and started to laugh. And my wife said, but why are you laughing? But he's Chinese, he should be ordering in Chinese. And I'm like, no, sorry. But you see, those are the kinds of assumptions you would get. All right, so then we have organizations. We establish organizations for the pursuit of specific ends or purposes. So we have professional organizations or associations. We have other types of organizations. We have universities, again, to meet particular ends or purposes. And so organizations would have its rules, it will have its regulations, it will have its various practices, its norms. I remember when I was a junior member of staff in the department, we had a head of department who would always say, no, that's the norm, and he would never use the regulations. He would always try to find a way to discriminate. And he would always say, no, that's the norm. That's the norm. And I didn't know any different. And I would assume, all right, the man know what you're talking about. He's the head of the department. And I would get roughed up all the time. And then it dawned on me, I should read the rules and check all the regulations and make sure. And so when he said norm, I said, no, friend, It works so. This is the regulations, it has to be by the book. Yeah, but I got bamboozled by norms, by what the normal practice was in an organization. So organizations of course would provide coherence. There's a reason why you want to have an organization, because it allows you then to have a set of people work within a set of parameters that are established and that will allow you to achieve your end. And of course, when you have organizations, not everybody will do the same thing. You would have different roles and responsibilities. And so we'll speak to that in a minute. Collectivities, you would have these are more specialized groups. So we talk about firms, you know, a law firm or a GIS practice, you know, as a firm. Families are considered a collectivity as well. Within an organization, you can have separate grouping as well, who would be responsible for different things. And so that is called a collectivity. Yeah. Then we have the roles. Yeah. So a lot of times people would talk about roles and responsibilities. What is your role? All the time. So I had a meeting earlier with my services staff, and I said, you know, I expect all of you to step up and help the Faculty of Engineering do his job. And one guy said, no, but you know, you're treating me badly. And he's a machinist. How can you expect us to go and you know, pressure wash the building? I said, no, listen, I expect you to be the best machinist we have. That's not your role. To pressure wash is not your role. Your role is to be a machinist. I expect you to do well with that. That's all I'm asking you to do your job well, to fulfill your role as best as you can. And so each of us, if we respect what our roles are and meet those requirements, then the institution, the group will function efficiently and effectively. And that's what it's about. So you have to fulfill your obligation. And a lot of times those obligations are to the team, the other people on the team. So you always hear about people talking about, well, you know, your husband's role is to do X, Y, and Z. But of course, that changed with time. Huh? The roles and responsibilities, the expectations are changing. There was a time when, you know, the men were the breadwinners. That isn't the case anymore. Yeah, it's interesting. Even on the St. Augustine campus, 70% of the students on the campus are women.
Yeah. Our Wednesday classes all women. Yeah.
You know, and so things are changing. In fact, what you're seeing as well, so the roles and responsibilities of the different genders are changing as well. And I remember somebody telling me, but teaching used to be a male profession, you know. It is perceived to be a female profession now. But I mean, not at the university level, but certainly the primary and secondary level. Things like photography is seen as a female profession. Like interesting, but that is what a lot of people are seeing it as. Even things like urban planning, to be a planner in certain contexts, that is seen as a female profession. It's been changing. So you would see things that are happening. And certainly, in fact, Valerie would tell you that there's recently a couple of books published on women in GIS and celebrating the fact that more and more women are getting into GIS. And I could see that happening where it may not get to, it will get more than balance, it will get to the other end, which is not a bad thing, you know. But but certainly you would see things evolving. There's a lot of scrutiny now with the automation, with AI, with respect to the nature of work and the whole evolution with respect to professions and what professions and what jobs are going to become redundant because of the technical innovations that are taking place. So you will see that happening as well. So society and the roles and responsibilities of various people within societies, within organizations are going to change. Anything to add there, Val?
No, well covered.
Right, and then we also talk about norms. Social norms of two types. We have the one that you're obligated, and the one that is permissive or regulated. Some norms specify positive obligation. Yeah. But not, it doesn't apply to everyone. So for example, the obligations that you have to your family would not be the same obligations you'll have, as a person in a business. Yeah. So there are different sets of obligations that you'll have to different people. So the norms, so the norms as a person who work at a university will be very different than if you're a teacher in a high school. And because the expectations are still have to teach, but aside from that, there are a lot of other things. Yeah. So some norms specify the limits of permissible action. Yeah. So there are some things you must do. There are some things you may do. And there are things that you must not do. Yeah. So these are the regulative norms. So in a society, regardless of one's role, one must not seek to influence others by threat or violence, or by violence itself. So, you can't ask, you can't threaten somebody to change their mind and agree with you. You can't force someone to see things your way. You're not supposed to. That's an expectation in most developed civilized societies, let's say. Yeah, so you're not supposed to do that. So no matter who you are, you're not supposed to do that. You could be the prime minister, or you could be a regular person working as a leader. You're not supposed to threaten anybody to influence how they make decisions, how they see things. Yeah. It's funny, only a couple of days ago, our prime minister said something that I thought was quite interesting, quite objectionable, in my opinion. There's a former police officer who was speaking on a prime platform, and the prime minister said the man should shut his mouth. And I was very surprised because, the prime minister is the chief servant of the people. And it is his job to ensure that every person's constitutional right to freedom of speech is protected. That's his job. That's his responsibility. So you can't turn around and say, listen, man, the man should shut his mouth. The man has freedom of speech. That's his opinion. He can say whatever he wants. And it is my job, as much as what you say may be offensive, it is my job to defend your right to say that. You see, that's how it works. And that is when we talk about norms, we have to recognize that. So Val, I see your hand is raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, so when you were talking about the different roles and responsibilities, and you mentioned the teacher, I thought of the group that is there now. There are certain norms as master students. Then you expect that the articles that are going to be given each read, you will be engaged in the discussion. That might be different from what you would expect at an undergraduate level. And so these are, so depending on your role, and while it is that nobody's going to force you to do it, the norm is if you're supposed to get the most out of it, then you recognize that this is of value to you and this is going to propel you. Whereas maybe an undergrad would say, you know, I can just kind of skate through this one.
Yeah, very much so in terms of what the expectations are. And so in fact, a lot of times when I deal with graduate students, I don't have to say, well, look, you need to do this, because you invested your own money and you expect to get a return on investment. And part of that investment is to spend the time and read the articles and do what you're supposed to do, because you have made a very deliberate choice by paying and expect to get value. And so that's why often I don't say, well, look, you know, you must do this, because the expectation is that you would, because you would want to get a return. And so we tend to leave it as that. But the undergraduate ones, oh gosh, different kettle of fish. And so, well, usually that you sometimes have to force them and encourage them and do everything. Find a way to convince them that this is important and you need to do it. And I suspect you can empathize with that. You were undergraduate yourself not so long ago. Yeah, and so I was undergraduate a long time ago, 85 to 88. Okay. Yeah, all right. So I want to and I see it's 6, but I want to run through this very, very quickly. All right, because this is important, and this has to do now with some of the way governance happens and legal and other associated issues. And a lot of times when you have to work in a context, it's important to understand how power and authority works. So this really switches now to look at what happens at the national level and the societal level with respect to some of the legal philosophies that will govern how societies operate. So I'll go through this relatively quickly, and if you do have questions, you could certainly ask with respect to this. So if you indulge me another half an hour, I suspect we'll be able to finish all of this. Yes, especially since we missed it last week. So why do we need laws, and what are the functions of laws relative to information, for example? We need laws because laws allow us to allocate property rights in terms of who owns what, and if you invest time and energy, then what are your rights with respect to property rights with respect to that data or that information that you would have generated. Laws will also facilitate contracts. If you want to do an agreement, you want to sell your data, or you want to license your data, laws would allow you to have contracts or to sign a contract or have agreements with respect to how you deal with the transactions that are appropriate to how you want to be able to deal with information, deal with your property, because your information could be seen as property. Yeah. Adjudicate competing claims for access to distribution channels. You know, so sometimes some people will say, no, I have rights, and you will turn around and say, no, but I have rights too. So the laws that exist will adjudicate those rights and who benefits and who doesn't, and or to what extent one party benefits as opposed to another one. Who determine who has rights to government information. The laws and in fact policies and laws at the national level, especially, will really speak to who will be given access. And part of one of the things we'll talk about later down would be the Freedom of Information Act. We'll talk about the Data Protection Act. We'll talk about privacy legislation as well, because these things are important in how government can have access to your information and what information you can have access to from government. So we will talk a little bit more about that. And these things are important when we talk about data sharing policies, when we talk about legal and ethical issues. So we'll see how that works. We also have laws to help us determine who bears the risks of loss from harm caused by information. And I don't know if you've been following the US news. Recently, the former president was charged for providing misinformation, for sharing lies, and therefore cause libel. And that's information that he shared, and damaged the reputation of the particular person who was sued, to the tune of $83.3 million. So the laws will provide for those kinds of things, because you never know how information you would have provided impacts. And therefore, if someone feels aggrieved, if someone is damaged, then there are laws to determine the extent to which that damage would have impacted someone or some organization, and therefore to determine what is required to be compensated. We have 4 traditional categories of information law that exist and exist in most countries, including Trinidad and Tobago. Broadcasting, and we have a whole telecommunications authority that will deal with broadcasting. Radio and television was the traditional way. Then you had common carriers like telephone and telegraph, which we no longer use. Although some countries still have those as backups for certain kinds of things. We have cable, and these days cable is now integrated with so many other things. We have publishing. A lot of people don't bother too much about print media, but it's still there. We still have 3 national newspapers in Trinidad and Tobago, but we're not much into print anymore because the cable provides TV, provides internet, provides other things. But really what we are seeing is that the boundaries amongst these 4 major categories on top are simply collapsing because of the internet. And so more and more we are thinking about cyber law, and a lot of the cyber law has to apply to geospatial information, because geospatial information is information, and therefore needs to be covered by some legislation. And so we have to evolve, and we see that as technology evolves, that we have to also think about making sure that legislation is enacted to continue to protect people. And that's why parliaments always exist, because no society is static, and we have to continue to enact legislation that are appropriate to the values of a society at any point in time. And so even when you pass a law, you pass legislation on a particular issue, ever so often the legislature will go back and revisit that legislation to see whether it needs updating, because things would have changed in society. Like only yesterday, I saw President Biden talking about the equality in pay legislation in the US, because women workers make 84 cents on the dollar in the US on average for the same job. That doesn't apply in Trinidad and Tobago for the most part. Equal pay, we've always had that. Except in the public service, if you work as land surveyors, there's a difference in payment for women and men surveyors, believe it or not. Oh yeah, That would have changed recently though, but that used to be the case. Lower for women. I am surprised you're asking if it's lower for women. Obviously, that's the discrimination that existed.
Well, because it was a male dominated role.
Yeah, and in fact, the men were protective to the point where they didn't want to send women out to the forest.
But it's still like that. It's still like that. Yeah. It's like even though we don't have one. National surveillance still, the.
Male, yeah. A pool? Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is, yeah, but my own experience, when I was a student here at the FIP, we had one female student, from Secretary come up. And, out of 16 students, we had one female student. And we used to always say that she was more man than the rest of us. She was more fit and more capable than all the rest of us. And some of us combined. She used to ride from Port of Spain to class every day and back home. And she was fit, amazingly fit. And so we would be winded, we walk a couple steps, and she would watch and smile and carry the equipment up the hill and come back and make the next trip. So of course, things are evolving, things are changing. And that has to do with the values of a society and how we perceive women and what their roles are in that particular society. So in civil societies, women are not allowed to hold office. They're not allowed to get an education. You go to Afghanistan and when the Taliban came back, all the women were removed from schools. So it's in some instances, they are regressing, they're going backwards. In other places, it's better, it's much better, it's evolved. All right, so when we think about how legislation is enacted and how we enshrine it into a society, a lot of countries will have constitutions. Most countries have written constitutions. The UK, I think, doesn't have one. But most other societies do have written constitutions, and a lot of times the power and how it's distributed would be spoken or detailed in the Constitution in terms of what powers different bodies would have. So you have what are called enumerated powers, the legislative power, so the legislative arm of government, the parliament. Parliament meaning the lower house and the upper house. We have what is called a bicameral system. So you have the House of Representatives and the Senate. And so that's the legislative branch. And then you have the executive branch, which is government, the ministers, cabinet, and so on. That's government. And then you have the judicial branch, that deals with making sure the laws are interpreted and judgments are handed down. And of course, there are implied powers. These are all the powers, other powers necessary in order to carry out the enumerated powers. So certain things are assumed. Yeah, and that will allow the government to do things in a particular way with the legislative branch and judicial branch. So some things are spelled out and some things are not, and they're implied, right? So what are the functions of law? Settling disputes, maintaining order, to provide a framework with which certain common expectations about transactions, relationships, planned happenings, and accidents of daily life can be met. So we create this framework to support a society. That's typically why you have laws. And of course, you would hear some people saying the law is an ass. You've heard that expression before? Because sometimes the law, the legislation that has been enacted is so old that it doesn't meet the requirements of modern society or an evolved society. And therefore, it doesn't reflect and it doesn't cover what is required at present. So it's not what it's supposed to be. And so in that case, you fix it, and so that's why there's always a parliament to do that. So the law will secure efficiency, harmony, and balance in the functioning of government machinery. Of course, we also want the law to protect citizens against excessive or unfair government power, and that could happen. We talk about the heavy hand of government, and some people will use it, especially if some government officials have dictatorial tendencies, you can have unfair treatment. We can use it to deny people access to certain goods and services. You can decide that you're going to discriminate against a particular group and treat people differently. And so you have laws that will protect, equal opportunity laws and so on to protect people. Protect people against excessive or unfair private power. So, a contractor comes and he decides to encroach on your land and build something, and too bad. Well, there are laws for that. You see, so that's what we mean by excessive or unfair private power. Somebody comes and they cover up a drain, or a river, some part of the river network, and because of that, you get flooded out. That is trespass. There's a law for that. Against whether it's government or private power. These are important things. So that there are provisions that will allow that, and it's important to understand how all of these things work in the context of geospatial information. So typically, at the end of the day, the law is to ensure people an opportunity to enjoy the minimum decencies of life. That's what a society and we have laws to do to make sure that we can have a decent life. In fact, what is interesting is I always remember a case where our Constitution has enshrined in it a guarantee to shelter, which is a very unusual thing. And in Trinidad and Tobago, therefore, that's why we have government housing, the government housing agency, because by law, by the Constitution, government of Trinidad and Tobago is supposed to provide shelter for its people. It's a very unusual thing. And I remember a court case where John Humphrey, a member of Parliament for St. Augustine at the time, took the government to court and said, listen, this quarter living on this land is guaranteed shelter, so find a way. And they have to. It's interesting, but that is what happens sometimes. That is very unusual in most other jurisdictions that happen. So we have some interesting things in our particular context. So the limits of law, a lot of times socioeconomic conditions and interests have a shaping influence on the law. Meaning that you have people who are influential. In Trinidad and Tobago, we talk about the 1%. In other places, you would have lobbyists in the United States, for example. You would have, for example, the conservatives have an inordinate influence on the law because their Supreme Court works differently based on appointment by the president and the Senate. And so if you have enough conservative people, although you may be in the minority, you could have undue influence. And that's what you're seeing in the United States at the moment, where basically the tail is wagging the dog with respect to where their particular legal system is going. So it's a little unfortunate, but that's just how it is. Sometimes you would have that happening. However, normally, and I say this carefully, normally, the law will not go too far from or far away from popular attitudes, habits, and ideas. Normally, but if you do have special interest group who are unduly influential, then it wouldn't be normal. Yeah, but normally that is what happens. The laws are reflected in functioning societies. You would see the laws actually adhering very closely to the attitudes, habits, and ideas. So that's typically what happens in these societies, but in other societies it's not. I don't know what works. Valerie, I don't know if you have any perception of how it works in Jamaica or in Guyana, but if you have had any thoughts on how their laws work and if there are undue influence from specific groups and parties.
Yeah, so in Jamaica, we're seeing quite a bit of that now, to the point where you're having, the Integrity Commission and other groups having to step in. So like you've said, sometimes the people who wield the power, they try to influence and shape the laws. You try to see once they're in, they're trying to change certain things that were constitutionally binding. And they try to get majority to change that. So I've definitely seen some of that happening in Jamaica. Also, I've experienced some similar things in Guyana as well. So I think it happens across the region.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that's the kind of thing that again, as professionals, you have to look out and often you're required to step up and show opinions and as part of being a professional is that you need to, when the opportunity arises, to speak to these kinds of things, because it's our responsibility, because staying quiet often is not an option, because when good people don't speak, then you would have the kind of evil that happens, and that's what you are trying to avoid. All right, let's continue. A couple little couple slides on information and why information is different. We know that this is becoming a very important resource. And in fact, I've said this even at the national level, that information is a national asset. It's really important, it's very valuable. It's different from traditional resources. We could think about physical material, labor, and capital. It's not a chair, it's not a table, it's very different. And this is something that one of my former professors came up with, and he said that information is expandable. You could add to it. A chair is a chair. It is what it is. It's not resource hungry. Once you have created it, you've created it. When you build one chair, you sell that, you have to get resources to build another one. Information, you have it, it exists, you can share it with 2 million people, and it doesn't require any more resources. So you spend once and use many times. Yeah, you could substitute it, you could get other information for your information. When you give away your chair, that's the chair. That's it, it's gone. It's transportable, meaning that you can take it anywhere you want. It's very easy, because when you fill your laptop with information, it's not heavy. It's not heavier. Yeah, it's very easy to transport, and it's shareable, meaning that I could give it to you and share it with you, and that's not a problem. So I could easily share information, as opposed to if I have one chair, I have one key, which I have, that's it. Yeah, yeah. So go ahead, Valerie.
So
You-
definitely love that slide because it is so true about how information is shareable. I'm going to share something with the group, which you may find to be interesting. So in October, at the 10th meeting of the UNGGIM Americas in Santiago de Chile, I launched a podcast called Mapping the Conversations. And so this was meant to be mostly for the Americas group, but because it's a podcast, it's available on Spotify, it's available at Apple, wherever you get your podcasts, and you can search for it. And it gives information about all of what we're discussing in GIS and Society, about the IGIF, about the United Nations Global Geospatial Information Management, things that you may not know about if you're not in that grouping. I have found that my biggest audience is in the US, but I also have an audience in Belgium, in Australia, all over the world. And the episodes since launch are getting more than 1,000 listens. So it tells you how information is shareable. I thought, okay, maybe a couple hundred, but certainly it has been doing better than I expected.
And very much so. And so that's the kind of thing that you're seeing, that it's a different type of resource. And you need to recognize that. And therefore, the provisions that you make to protect it, to when you make arrangements for selling or sharing or licensing, you need to recognize that you're dealing with something that's very different. Another thing, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, is that you have to think in terms of what is a public good, as opposed to something that is really something that is private and something that you could sell, something that you really is more private, and we'll talk about that a little bit. You always hear, especially in societies like ours, that healthcare is a public good. Yeah, but we have a lot of private providers as well. So we can actually privatize healthcare without a problem if we wanted to. But there are certain things that we say, well, all right, that really ought to be a public good. So, for example, garbage collection. We don't make any real money from that. It's something that we do, and as a society that we have to collect, because it's very obvious if we don't provide that public service. You'll smell it, you'll see it, and so we would know. And so it's non-rival, meaning there's no competition. We can't compete. And it's non-excludable. We can't leave out anyone. Yeah. So that's typically what we talk about when we talk about public good. So that's why we have public service. Yeah. So we talk about Adam Smith, who is well known for his theories. Talk about how economies work and how businesses would work and how we deal with competition and so on. And he talked about people pursuing their own self-interest, their own individual economic interests. And he says that in order for markets to work, you must have excludability, you must have rivalry, and you must have transparency, which means that if you compete, assuming that all things are equal, then the market will take care of itself, and everybody will benefit because everybody's looking after their best interests, and therefore people will always get the best value when they go out to secure goods, because the market has regulated itself. Unfortunately, that don't work. He's also said this, that competition is ruthless, unprincipled, uncharitable, unforgiving, and a boon to society. But of course, what we have discovered that is not so, because when we deal with the normal competition, we don't know whether those regular legislation will control the flow of information properly. And so we have to think about what would be appropriate to meeting the needs of information management and competition and all the issues surrounding information. So we'll get to that. I'm not going to talk about this. This really talks about how the power associated with traditional resources. The laws that we are dealing with now has to evolve to deal with new things, because there's a time when secrets were kept, not anymore. We typically, like, no one knows. We always talk about KFC secret recipe, right? These days you can reverse engineer and find out exactly. Yeah? And a trade secret, for example, that is kept very tightly. Most of you know what Angostura Bitter is, right? Angostura has a royal charter from the British royal family, and you could go anywhere in the world, including Alaska or Antarctica or Australia. I was in some little place in India, in a place called Kerala. Angostura Bitter. Yeah, that's how well known it is. And so, but these things are changing, and it's not difficult for people to reverse engineer. And people, it's amazing. I could tell Valerie something today. She's in the US, and next thing you know, it can come full circle and come back to me in a couple hours, because that's how it is. The systems are changing, and so the traditional parameters and the typical hurdles and limitations no longer exist when it comes to certain kinds of things, and especially information and information as a resource. So we will talk a little bit about that. We will go through all of this later on when we talk about the difference between data, information, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. And these are just definitions here. And more, we're not talking about geospatial information infrastructure. We're talking about geospatial knowledge infrastructure. That's the latest thinking with respect to how we are developing systems, especially with all the new technologies, the AI and all the things that we do have. So that's a new thing at the UN level. They're talking about GKI, geospatial knowledge infrastructures. Any thoughts on the geospatial knowledge infrastructure, Valerie, or you're familiar?
Yeah. Well, it's just to say that that is something. So, we have gone through this evolution when traditionally we were talking about just NSDI, and NSDI was that National Spatial Data Infrastructure. We went, and the thought at the UN level was then the integrated geospatial information framework, IGIF, UN IGIF. And now one of the things that we're seeing is it's an ecosystem of systems, so to speak, where we're looking at knowledge infrastructure, because we recognize that information is not enough, but it's that knowledge infrastructure. So soon we're going to get to the point where instead of people are trying to not share their data, they will be left behind, because you're going to get to a point where you'll be having knowledge as a service, so to speak.
Yeah, and more, that's where we're going in terms of how do you leverage all the data, all the information you have to create the kind of knowledge that we require to support decision making. One of the things I've been thinking about, I have to do a lecture in June for inaugural lectures. I've just been promoted to professor, and so professors must do an inaugural lecture. And I'm thinking in terms of what to speak about with respect to how societies ought to be leveraging the geospatial tools and technologies that we have to support the advancement of society. And therefore, what are the knowledge products, what are the knowledge, artifacts, if you like, that we can have for a society like ours to support it progressing and moving forward. And I haven't thought through the whole thing yet. I still have until June to do it. But that's the kind of thing I'm looking at, and I'm thinking, you know, when you look at the context of our particular society, how do you go from where we are to there? What would it take? And the optimist is saying, well, yes, there must be a way to do it. But the pessimist is saying, we can't get there from here, which is an awful thought to think about. But you know, I remember when I lived in Maine, there are people, when you ask them, well, how do you get there? And they say, well, you can't get there from here. There's no road to connect this town to this town, meaning directly. You have to go around and find ways to circumvent and go around. So they would always, that's an expression my wife always uses, well, you can't get there from here. And so it's not a straightforward thing, and you have to go in a circuit to get there. So there are a lot of thinking in terms of how we evolve this, but certain societies, they're way ahead and they're moving ahead with a lot of these kinds of things. But and so part of the work that Valerie and I are doing is how do we empower the Caribbean region to get there from where we are? And I will tell you, it's a never-ending series of challenges to be able to do that. But we are still optimistic. At least I am. I think Valerie is young enough to be optimistic with respect to where we go with it. So, any last words as we wrap?
No, I've just I think there's a lot to really think about. Just to say, as we look at geospatial and society, it's an exciting world. There's never a dull moment in the geospatial industry. Yes, I've been here for a long time, less than Dr. Ramla, of course. But some days I still get jaded and wonder if we can get there. But I think we need persons like you who are open-minded and also who are going to recognize the value and see applications that it can have for our Caribbean society.
So thank you very much, Valerie, as I stop sharing here. And I also need to stop the recording.